Everybody, and welcome to our webinar today. I'm Abram, and I'll be with you for the next hour or so as we continue on in the Gospel of Mark. This is translation notes, Mark 14:43 through 52. This is part 3. We will wrap up the passage today, covering just 2 verses. And as time permits, we can look back over any parts of this passage that folks have questions about, or even any unifying themes. But verses 51 and 52 are what we'll cover today. In terms of the webinar itself, the goal here is to work through the lexical and grammatical issues that come up when we translate the Greek text of Mark into English. So questions at the level of meaning, and what is this word, and how is it used elsewhere, and how does that shed light on how Mark uses it here? And then questions at the level of parts of speech, and maybe how the words work together, why this parsing here, why the position of this word here. Those are the more grammatical questions that we cover. If you've been to these webinars before, you know that we focus more on Greek and translation than we do on accordance itself. This is not as feature focused of a webinar as some of the other ones we have. All of our webinars are recorded and available. If you go to your help menu and webinars, that will take you to a page that has all of our recorded webinars. If there's any question you have, it probably has been addressed there, and if it doesn't, of course, we'd be happy for you to reach out to us. There's a handout available to you in the GoToWebinar control panel. It looks like this. It will guide our time together, just 3 pages. And if you're watching on a recording after the fact, you can access that at tinyurl.com/marktranslationnotes. That is now up to date with everything through this part of Mark. You can also email me, abramkj@accordancebible.com. Questions or comments are welcome at any time in the questions box, and you can contact me that way. It's like a one-way typed chat, and I'll either anonymously share your comment with everyone and respond, or respond privately. All right, well, on with the webinar itself. Let's review and make sure we get a sense of where we are today. And in part, I want to do this whole passage because it really does hang together. I've started the passage at verse 43. Verse 42 gives us the setup to it. So I thought we would start there because, in fact, what we see in these last 2 verses, I'll just preview it. We get this, I think I used the word postscript last week, or an epilogue. It's a little puzzling, at least at first, why Mark includes this in the first place, and we will consider that together. But what we'll see today is after Jesus is apprehended and the disciples all run away, it will say a certain young man was following him, wearing nothing but a linen cloth, and they apprehended him. But he, getting free, fled naked, leaving his linen cloth behind. And that's the end of this passage, because after that, we're going to see that they're leading Jesus to the high priest. That's in verse 53. So this is a distinct passage here with perhaps an odd ending. We'll look at that together, but I want to get all of the run up to it, because we have some themes being recapitulated here, even in these last 2 verses, and some lexical links to the rest of the passage. So verse 42, Jesus had said, "Get up, let's go. Behold, the one who betrays me is approaching." And immediately, while Jesus was speaking, Judas, one of the 12, approached, and with him a crowd with swords and clubs. The crowd was from the high priests and law experts and elders. And then Mark gives his background information. Now the betrayer had given them a sign saying, "Whomever I kiss, he is the one. Apprehend him and take him away under guard." Back to the mainline narrative. And as soon as he arrived, he went up to Jesus, saying, "Rabbi," and he kissed him. Then they put hands on him and apprehended him. And one of those standing by drew his sword and struck the servant of the high priest and cut off his ear. Then Jesus responded, "Have you really come with swords and clubs to detain me like a violent criminal? Every day I was with you in the temple teaching, and you did not apprehend me. but this is happening now in order to fulfill the scriptures. Then everyone left him and fled. That was where we left off last week. And just to review, we've got a really succinct, really short sentence here from Mark. Kai aphantes auton ephugon pantes. And you could translate it as a participle with an indicative verb. Well, that is in fact what it is. So you could translate it as, and leaving, everyone fled. But I noted last time, I think this is a participle of attendant circumstance, which just means that you can translate it as if it's two main verbs. And I also noted that the NET, and this will be relevant today, the NET translation, or the Net Bible, it clarifies in its translation this pantes. Mark doesn't clarify. Mark just says everyone or all, but the NET says all the disciples. And I think that's a justified translation, even if I didn't do that myself, because the people who are arresting Jesus, apprehending him, detaining him, taking him off to the high priest, they are not fleeing because they're in fact taking Jesus somewhere. And we'll see that right here, pegagon, and they led him. So they're still in the picture, they're still in the story where Mark is focusing us, but the disciples are not. They run off, you know, they run off screen. I mean, they're out of there. And it's disciples because the other people are still involved. So I think this is a justified translation, even if disciples, that word is not in Greek. And that just reminds us that as one-to-one as we might like to be, there are certainly instances where sometimes bringing out some specificity that's not there in the Greek is a good idea. So whether you choose to do that as NET does, or whether you don't as I didn't, that's the idea, that all the disciples left. Now, that's an interesting phrase because, well, for two reasons at least. Number one, that really sounds like a good end. I mean, not a good ending, it's actually a very bad ending. But in terms of writing a narrative, there's a lot of closure here. This is a very stark way to end a scene. It's nice and short, it's punchy, it's maybe a little bit alarming, or maybe the reader's not alarmed because they've seen the betrayal, they've seen the falling asleep, and they can't watch and pray. But at any rate, it's just a very powerful and evocative line. So Mark could end there, and in fact, if we're reading slowly, at least I expect that that's it. You know, that everyone left him and fled. All right, so they're gone, and now Mark's either going to follow them with his narrative, or he's going to follow Jesus. He will follow Jesus. But in verse 51, there's a little bit more that Mark wants to tell us. So let's look at that in accordance, and we'll spend our time on these two verses today. Kai neaniskas tis sune koluthe auto, peribeblemenas sindana epigymnu, kai kratusin auton. If we go left to right, we'll get and a young man, one or a certain young man, was following him. This is the imperfect, and so we get the sense this is an ongoing action. Was following him. Then here's a participle, wearing sindona, a linen cloth around his nakedness, and they seized him, and they arrested him. All right, there are some challenges, I think, in this verse. Let me give you at least my first pass at a translation. A certain young man was following him being Jesus, maybe you bring that out, wearing nothing but a linen cloth, and they apprehended him. And we need a comma here because the sentence is not done. We'll see the rest of verse 52. The first question is a simple one that comes up from time to time, which is, how do you translate Kai? You could translate it as and, or but, or now, or then, or even this pleonastic Kai. The pleonastic Kai means that it's not really something that you translate. Just looking, if I go to the Pocket New Testament Greek Dictionary, just give a good definition. Pleonastic will be in there, redundant. And so it's something, in this case, a participle, but a pleonastic chi, you could think of it as just signaling a new sentence, almost like a verse marker. Of course, Mark did not write in chapters and verses or think in those terms, but the chi's set apart the verses often, or you could even just think of it as a capital letter. So it doesn't have to be translated. Here, I haven't translated it at all, following many other translations. But you could translate it as and or but or now or then. And really the question is, how does this verse connect or not to the verse in front of it? And sometimes it's as simple as there's maybe a list of actions and the word and is the only possible translation. Sometimes it's a new scene, so you do something like then or now. Other times it's pleonastic. I probably mention this every few weeks just because there's so many chi's in Mark, and I don't personally spend a lot of time with every single one, but I do at least spend a little bit of time. And for me, the question here, whether I translate this or not, what it taps into for me is, what is Mark doing now? And we'll look at that more together. But for now, I've just decided I'll take that as a pleonastic chi, again, following many other translations. I'm not sure how it connects yet to the verse before it, so I'll just start the verse, a certain young man. And that's all that the tease gives us, a certain young man. Not every translation has gone with that. If you go to live, click here and make sure that your gear icon, click it and make sure that your verse lookup is showing. If you click on this reference, which I just did, you get a certain young man in the ASV, one young man, a certain young man, and sometimes you'll just get a young man. You could think of that T similarly to the chi. It doesn't have to be translated, but I do want to translate it because it's there. It doesn't have to be. And it almost makes you wonder, did Mark, I mean, it seems like Mark knew exactly who the man was. Did Mark expect the readers to know as well? Is that what the tease is about? I think this gets into speculation pretty quickly, as we'll see today. But for my part, I think a certain young man is the way to translate it. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that Mark is wishing to evoke the thought of a particular named individual. Certain can be used that way, but it can also just mean something like a distinct individual. Or if you want to paraphrase even more, you could say, now there was just one more person hanging on. So that tease has a focusing function, if not clarifying that, you know, I, Mark, and you, my first century readers, we all know who this is. It was a certain young man. I don't think we can conclude that with certainty, although many people have concluded that. So I think in translation, bring it out as certain and just understand that even that word in English can be used in multiple ways. And even though it's a very definite sounding word, this is still an indefinite young man that Mark has not named, if that makes sense. All right, so what about this mysterious young man whose identity we will consider today, and whose identity we do not need to know or even make a list about possibilities for the sake of translation? I mean, Mark has given us as much as he's given us with this, and we just follow suit in translation. So the good news is, as we go on today and try to wonder about who this guy is, and I would love your comments and questions as we do that. We don't need to do more than the translation is doing. We don't need to figure it out for the sake of translation. Of course, we want to know, so we will explore it, but the translation part is done. All right, so what was this certain young man doing? He was following him, sune koluthe. He was following auto, Jesus. Accordance is good about showing you not only information in the instant details, but it will show you the roots that make up a word. So we've got a compound verb here. This may look familiar to you. This augmented theta is coming from the alpha in akolutho, and you can see that here. I'm sorry, akolutheo. You can see that here in the instant details. The soon is with. We have the syn prefix in English, like synonym, symphony, that this idea of togetherness or similarity. So that's there. So the question I have is, what is this prefix doing to this word akolutheo that I might already know? Now in my instant details, I just get a gloss or a translation equivalent of to accompany, to follow, and that's the same as akolutheo. Let's triple click this, and in BDAG we get soon akolutheo. Let me just duplicate this tab. So I'm right clicking, duplicating the tab. I'm going to just go in here and delete the prefix. I'm going to take out the scripture reference and just search akolutheo so that we have that. All right, so I'm going to drag this down here, and now we've got both these verbs together. And we can see with akolutheo, that word means to move behind someone in the same direction, to come after. So it's follow in a literal sense, not the metaphorical lifelong following. It's just you're walking down the street and a cat starts following you because it wants to see where you're going. It can mean accompany. It can also mean to follow someone as a disciple. Akolutheo can. And that, in fact, is also the meaning of soon akolutheo here. It's very similar. The question is, why does Mark use the prefix soon? Why doesn't he just use akolutheo? I don't know. That would be one of many questions I might ask Mark if I ever would have a chance. BDAG does shed a little bit of light on here. It gives us a translation equivalent that's really similar to akolutheo, but it does note here in the entry that follow has the connotation of being a disciple. So even if Mark would have been served just as well with akolutheo, maybe, and this is just speculation, but maybe it's that Mark wanted to be clear that he didn't want to use a word with three possible meanings, or a literal following and a metaphorical following, and he meant the whole life following, and so he used the prefix to clarify. That's my best guess. And regardless of why he chose this verb over this verb, the meaning, I think, is pretty clear. He's not just saying, in my read, he's not just saying there was a certain young man who was following Jesus in the sense of like peering around the corner and kind of tracing their steps. It's that he was following him in this discipleship sense of the word. This, what do we have here? Yeah, the connotation of being a disciple. So I think that's open to interpretation, and I could see disagreement with that, even with the soon here, but this is how BDAG reads it. This would be a good opportunity as well, I think, with this particular word, to go to your info pane and see what your different commentaries give you. It may or may not treat that exact word, but I would just start clicking them open and look for it in the entries, especially the ones that are like NIGTC or UBS Translators Handbooks will often have something good about this. Another thing you would do, and I'll stop here with this word, but you could trace all the uses of both of these words. This particular word is not used terribly often, although it is used elsewhere in Mark. And so we could look at that and consider, is there any distinct difference between, yeah, and see even here, it reads more like a company, like in a short-term sense. So I'm not sure that there's too much weight that we need to put on that prefix, but it is something to pay attention to and at least consider. Like I said, I think it is possible that Mark is just saying that this young man was following him that day. But I think more likely, while being very open to folks' disagreement, more likely, I think we're looking at a disciple here. And that's the kind of following that Mark has in view. Now, this is a classic example of where I'm not 100% sure. I will see, is there an English word that does the same thing that the Greek word does? And in fact, the English word follow does this quite fine. In other words, it permits that meaning of following as a disciple, but it doesn't 100% commit me to it. And that, I think, if I can preserve that level of, maybe it's not intentional ambiguity, maybe I'm just not figuring Mark out, but if that's where I'm at with the Greek, if I land there with the Greek, and if there's an English equivalent that does the same thing, I actually feel really good about that, because then you could read either kind of following from this. All right, so yeah, I said not that it doesn't already have the discipleship connotation with akolutheo, but perhaps Mark is making that more explicit here. So in this kind of following Jesus, and maybe here's some evidence against what I'm saying, which is that it's just talking about trailing after him, because now it's talking about not the way in which he's being a disciple, but the way in which he's following Jesus. Like, what's this guy look like? What's he doing? What are the circumstances? Well, Mark says he's wearing nothing but a linen cloth. You get a challenging phrase here. It's peribeblemenos syndona epigumno, wearing only a piece of clothing over his nakedness. I think the place to start here is with wearing. That is, let me just get my instant details open. That is probably easy enough to translate here. Some type of cloth, we'll come back to that. And over his nakedness, and if we triple click this, we'll see that that typically is what this means. It's a funny way to talk, I think. Mark must be trying to connote something with that. And I think what he's trying to say is that it's not much that's covering his nakedness. And folks have speculated about what this could mean. I've put a list of options straight out of SIL Exegetical Summary Series here in the handout. It's possible he only had a linen sheet around him. And this was a sheet, according to another commentary, that he had quickly wrapped around him when he was awakened by the noise of the crowd passing by his house. So if that's the interpretation, the sunakolutheo is not necessarily talking about discipleship, although it doesn't rule it out, but it's saying more that he just kind of jumped up and ran after Jesus, and he's got this linen sheet around him. And that has good explanatory power for why does Mark say covering his nakedness. We don't usually talk that way. And you could look and see with this word clothing, does the word naked, covering up nakedness, get used in the New Testament in conjunction with wearing? That's typically a funny or even redundant way to talk, unless you're wanting to highlight the nakedness. And I think this interpretation does that well, because there's like a suddenness there, like he barely had enough time to throw on a robe. Another possibility, SIL Exegetical Summary Series has cataloged this. He was wearing a linen garment. It may mean that he was wearing nothing except a linen tunic. This thought, again, being roused from his sleep. Instead of a sheet, it's a tunic. One commentary gives us that it was a loincloth. I don't think Mark is crystal clear here. And really, it's regardless of how we translate this, I think the idea is that there is some level of kind of hurry and not rashness, but just like there wasn't time, almost to get fully dressed. I think that's where the piece of cloth covering his nakedness comes in. That's what Mark, I think, is evoking. So I say all that because I actually think there are a lot of good ways you could translate this. Wearing nothing but a linen cloth, even something like, if you wanted to be really concise with this, you could just say who had hastily gotten dressed, if you agree that that's the implication here. I mean, Mark doesn't say hastily for sure, so maybe that feels like over translating to you, but I think there's a lot of good options, and live click, as always, will take us to them very quickly. If we click on the verse, we get having a linen cloth cast about him, wearing a linen cloth about his body, wearing nothing but a linen cloth. And I like that because, and I think that's what, yeah, in fact, that was exactly how I translated it. I like that because it does not translate the nakedness word literally, but it does translate what I think is the meaning of it, that he's wearing nothing but, he's naked except for this. Well, that means he's not naked. So in translation, I don't use the word naked. I'm just saying wearing nothing but. I think that makes sense. And you'll see something similar, like nothing but a linen cloth, wearing nothing but a linen cloth. Here we have having a linen cloth thrown around his naked body. So that's a good way, I think, to translate. It preserves the word naked from Mark. The thrown there is interpretive, because how do we know he threw it? But again, if you think that's the sense that Mark is giving us, then go for it. But you'll see a lot of translations with a mere cloth or nothing but a cloth wrapped around his body. There is still the question of, is it a cloth? Is it a sheet? Is it a shirt? I mean, one of the things I'm most convinced about in this passage is I don't think that that's super important to Mark. You get from BDAG a light piece of clothing. Shirt is a translation equivalent. It could be linen. It doesn't have to be linen. You could look at that word in more detail. Fabric made from linen is one possibility, but here we just get that it's a light piece of clothing. In fact, here, this is either linen, usually, or cotton. It is impossible to determine from the scanty context the nature of the fabric. And again, I really don't think Mark is concerned about the nature of the fabric. I think he's concerned about the nature in which the fabric was put on and the other circumstances around this guy following Jesus and running off. But even that is sparse. So I don't think the word linen needs to come out in translation, but it could. I've put that there in mind. Of course, you could do a word study of that word and see, does Mark use it elsewhere? Does the New Testament use it elsewhere? But like I said, I'm not sure that's the most essential piece. And so even just wearing a piece of clothing, I think, would be sufficient. So this may require some creativity in how to translate, just because like I said, it is odd to talk about wearing clothes except for the part where he wasn't wearing clothes. Well, it's like, why would you say that? And which is a good question. You know, what is Mark trying to communicate? And it may be that you go with that translation that said thrown about his body. Maybe that makes the most sense to you. I'm going to pause there because we've just set up everything we know about this guy, which is that he's a certain young man. He is young. We know that. We know that he was following Jesus. And we know that he's wearing nothing but a linen cloth. And now we're going to get the actual main verb. But let me just pause there and catch up on questions or comments that you've got. Yeah, here's a great comment, and I would tend to agree with this. To that question of sune koluthe, why not both? Short term that day, kind of following along, and also long term, as Mark reflects on that young man, possibly himself over time. Yeah, and in fact, that would include even all of these explanations. So it could be, in the end, we just don't know. But it could be that he was a disciple, and he was nearby, and he quickly jumped up, and he wrapped a sheet around him, and he followed Jesus that day. It could very well be both. I think that's a great explanation. That seems really plausible to me. Here's another comment. I'm going to put this in the chat and read it. Somebody says, also not passing by his house, but what if the upper room was in Mark's home? Barnabas, being Mark's uncle, Mark's parent, could have also been wealthy and have a home big enough to host the Last Supper, Passover meal. Mark was excited about Jesus being at his home and secretly left it to follow him when Jesus and his disciple left. He took his bedsheet as cover. Okay, great. Thanks for that comment. Let's see what else. Oh, here's a great comment. And yeah, this too, same person commenting. This may be yeah, I would elevate this in importance to what the particular clothing was. This person says, whatever the article of clothing was, it came off as easy as the young man fled. It came off easy as the young man fled. Yeah, so which I think maybe is why people have said a bed sheet, because we're going to see in verse 52, he left his linen cloth behind. So yeah, possible it's like a button-down shirt and he's quickly unbuttoning it, but that doesn't seem as likely. Something that comes off quickly makes more sense. Let's see the comment here. There's another comment from somebody else. Do not call lutheo in this context. It is clear that he is physically following Jesus. Soon adds the idea of association with to emphasize the teen's connection to Jesus. Interesting. That's great. He is not simply a looky-loo observing the event. Excellent. Good. Yeah, that's a great way to explain it, to understand this word. So there's a connection of some kind there with that prefix. Good. These are great comments. All right, well, they're gonna apprehend this guy, kind of, maybe not. I mean, it says they apprehend him in this verse. Really, we need to read 51 and 52 together. I know we're just doing a verse at a time, but what happens next is kai kratusin auton. We've seen this verb before. If I search for this lexeme, there's krateo in the Greek New Testament. I can just skip ahead to Mark here. Scroll ahead, or I could have typed a range in the search entry area, but here it is in verse 44 and 46 and 49. I can go back to my handout because I've got those here. So we had the agreement, in the background information here, the parenthetical information, where Judas told them to apprehend Jesus or seize him or arrest him. It's that same verb. Verse 46, they put hands on him and apprehended him. And then verse 49, and you did not apprehend me. So that's all the same verb, and it's now also used of this guy. Now, so what I typically would say here, as you know, if you've been to these webinars before, is if possible, and it's not always possible, but if possible, especially within the same passage, it's great to translate the same Greek word with the same English word. It is possible that it would shift meaning even within a passage, but more often than not, at least as a default, at least as a first pass, I'm going to try to be consistent there so that if my readers don't know Greek, or that if I'm looking at this later, just my own English translation without the Greek, I want to be tipped off to the word repetition here. Just as Mark is doing that in Greek, I want to do that in English. So I don't want to vary this too much. I want a consistency check across my translation here. So following that principle, I would translate this as they apprehended him. Now, maybe for krateo, you've been using seized or arrest or detain. So whatever it is, if you've been consistent, maybe your first thought is, let's be consistent again here. But what makes this a little tricky, and I've just translated it as apprehended him, but he's actually going to get free in the next verse. And we'll come to the next verse in a moment, but he's actually going to get free and run off. So I see a couple possibilities. One is they did actually apprehend him, or they started to apprehend him, or they grabbed him and took hold of him successfully, but then he got free. That to me is the most natural read. But another possibility is that they tried to apprehend him, and that you translate it that way. And again, the word try, there's not a Greek equivalent per se in the Greek text, but it would translate very well what is actually happening, which is that however successful they were, whatever percentage of apprehending they achieved, however much they held him for, whatever part of his shoulders or his arms or his legs they got, he got free. So krateo, apprehended, here I'm just being consistent with how I've been in the rest of the passage. It is maybe a little bit misleading to translate it as they apprehended him, but he actually got free, unless you can just make it clear. And I tried to do this with the translating the contrast. I'm reading this as they started to apprehend him and it looked like they were going to be successful, but then he got free. But you could just say they tried to apprehend him, or they tried to seize him, however you're translating it. I think it is in, I don't remember now the translation, but I did see, so here's a Berean Bible, they caught hold of him. That's interesting. They grabbed him. That's interesting too. So they grabbed, that seized is there, but it's not the successful grabbing like they did of Jesus, where they've got him in custody. So maybe that's the difference here. They don't have him in full custody. If you want to think about the the sports corollary, they don't have full possession of the ball. It wasn't in both hands. That's the image that we get, and we have to go into verse 42 to get that, which is why I don't want to really have a final draft of a translation until I get all the way through the passage, because if I just stopped here, I'm going to think, well, they seized him, they apprehended him, and he's going to get carried off. But in fact, it was an unsuccessful attempt. But it's the same word, which is interesting. So make of that what you will. I don't know whether Mark is explicitly trying to draw a parallel between this guy and Jesus. Maybe he is, maybe he isn't. Maybe back to this idea of this soon prefix, maybe he's saying, go the way of Jesus and get apprehended like Jesus. That's a possibility. Mark's not saying that explicitly. Maybe it's there, but you've got some options here for translation as well. The big question here that doesn't need to be answered for translation, but that we want to at least explore, and I'll just suggest some directions, because I do want to get to this next verse and welcome lots of questions. But why did they apprehend this guy? Who was he? And why did they apprehend him? Well, my best guess is the disciples are all running away, and it doesn't tell us explicitly why, but maybe it's that they're worried that they're going to get arrested too, and maybe that was a well-founded fear, and maybe they were going to arrest this guy, and in fact they were. So maybe that's maybe there was just something about they were going to arrest Jesus and anyone who was with him. So that could answer the why. Now, I don't know why they would feel the need to arrest the others. Maybe they thought they were complicit in the violent criminality of Jesus. Do you remember, why have you come to detain me like a violent criminal? Maybe the thought is everyone with him is just as much of a risk, just as much of a threat. So we've got to go after them. Well, for whatever reason, they're going after this guy. Maybe they think he's a threat too. Mark doesn't tell us who he is. I've just summarized some future directions for research. You may have already looked into this. Mark Strauss, in his Zondervan exegetical commentary, says, this is one of the strangest incidents, not only in Mark, but in the whole of the gospel tradition. Who was this young man, and why did Mark include this odd episode in his gospel? A bewildering array of suggestions have been made, and then Strauss goes on to list 13 different suggestions, which I just so appreciate when a commentary does that. And then he'll weigh in and say, I don't think it was these ones. I think it could be this one. I think it's most likely this one. Strauss continues, the best guess, and they're a little more than that, is either the default answer that this is an unknown follower of Jesus, and so that's a distinct view that he's cataloged, perhaps known to Mark's readers, or that it is John Mark himself. And the idea here, I don't know if anyone here has watched or is familiar with the Marvel movies. Commentary was saying that Alfred Hitchcock would do this too, but Stan Lee, the creator of Marvel, would write himself into these movies. Other directors and producers will do that too sometimes for this little bit part. And if you don't know what he looks like, he's just a random guy in a scene. But if you know what he looks like, you realize that's the person who's behind all this. So that is a well-worn literary cinematic technique by now, and it's possible that Mark was doing that. I wouldn't say writing himself into the story, because if he was already there, he was already there. He's just highlighting his own participation in that view. Now, the text doesn't give us that evidence itself. R.T. France disagrees pretty strongly with this. He says this was hallowed, he had a great phrase for it, something like this view was hallowed by repeated conjecture or something like that. So the idea being that people have just said it for a long time, and it's just sort of caught on. Yeah, here's where he mentions how Hitchcock would do that. It may be quite a good conjecture in that it does at least offer some reason for the inclusion of what otherwise appears a very inconsequential coda to the Gethsemane story. So I'll leave it at that, and just to know that this is really a fruitful avenue of research, and in accordance, can enable this. I would open up a research window, or maybe just go to the info pane and start opening commentaries. There's a lot of hyperlinking between commentaries in accordance as well, and see what they have to say. Yeah, here's the phrase, hallowed by frequent repetition. But he does say this could be a great conjecture because it answers the question of why are these two verses here? And if this is John Mark, the author of the gospel, that's a great answer as to why these two verses are here. Is because he's making a cameo appearance, and maybe that lends some authenticity to his account. He was an eyewitness. I myself saw this. He's not saying that explicitly, so we're left to what is hopefully grounded speculation. But if you want to see more, Strauss will list the possibilities, but you may have another commentary that does the same thing. And I just listed another few of the possibilities here from the Board Biblical Commentary. So this person's going to run off, this young man's going to run off, and we'll do this last verse. But before we do, let's just stay here with this guy and see. I want to catch up on comments. Yeah, here's a comment that krateo never means arrest in this context, and that BDAG agrees. Right, thank you for that. And another comment, maybe caught but not being the person of interest and being young, the captors let him go and he fled before they changed their mind. All right, yeah, that's an interesting thought. Any other comments or questions, especially about the identity of this person? I know this is a short overview of what, I mean, you could spend the rest of your day studying this profitably, although in the end, in my opinion, I mean, for sure, Mark doesn't say explicitly who it is. In my opinion, I don't know that you could ascertain. I don't know on what grounds you do that, but you could at least study the history of interpretation. Is there some external evidence elsewhere that talks about this? I'd especially look, if I were going further on this question, I would especially look at what do the first few centuries of interpretation say about this? Not that they're more authoritative by virtue of the century that they interpreted in, but they are closer to the time period. So maybe oral accounts were kind of more present. So you might even do that. Something like the Ancient Christian Commentary on Scripture, and see if that's got some clues there. All right, well, he gets free, leaves whatever clothing he had on behind, and now we get the same word for naked, and now he is actually naked. I mean, that there's no naked but with a little bit of clothing. I mean, he runs off. So let's go to the Greek here in verse 52. And we've got ha de katalipon tain sindana gumnas effugen, left to right. But he, so there's ha, that can be the definite article, but in this case it is the pronoun he. He, leaving his clothing or leaving the cloth, naked, ran away. And left to right, something like, but he, getting free, fled naked, leaving his linen cloth. And you might even use the word leaving his linen cloth behind. This getting free piece I put in brackets, and that's a little clunky, admittedly, and that's just my way of trying to have a good way to translate krateo, but not, but to show that it wasn't successful. And maybe just the fleeing makes that clear already. So same word here, same piece of clothing as in verse 51, whatever that is, whether it's a sheet or a shirt, or if you just split the difference with cloth because you're not sure and you know that you can't be sure, and so that's as much as you want to do. Whatever you decide in verse 51, same thing in verse 52. Effugen comes from fugo, to flee, and that was the same verb as in verse 50. If we go back to the beginning here, then everyone left him and fled. So we have another lexical link, a lot of words that keep occurring in this passage that hold it together. It's the same verse or same verb as verse 50, used of Pontes in that case, everyone, all of the disciples. Yet here is another follower of Jesus fleeing. So I just find it interesting, and I think this is part of what adds to the mystique of this passage, is that this hanger-on comes after the all-inclusive Pontes. It's not just that the rhetorical effect of the disciples leaving or fleeing made me think the passage was done. It's that Mark said all, Pontes. And so in my mind, every last one is gone. So that really does make this feel like a postscript, but clearly there was at least this one other person. But it's interesting that even after the Pontes, you get him. Now, even he who is left after everyone has left, and he's still there even after everyone is gone, even he flees. So I think rather than reading that as contradictory, I read it as just this powerful statement that even this guy, even this straggler, even he fled. And this one who was with Jesus, who was following him. So that, I think, is in one of the, here, France says, this adds yet more to the sense of Jesus's abandonment. Because you get this jolt in the story of, well, I thought everyone left, but here's this certain young man, and he's not kind of wearing the typical garb, and they're seizing him, and oh, maybe he'll follow Jesus or be seized with Jesus or whatever. But in fact, he also gets free and runs off. So I think that it makes for a very powerful postscript if you want to read it as a postscript. But yeah, he gets free, and he flees. He runs off. That same verb as in verse 50. This is interesting, to seek safety in flight. So BDAG gives flee as the translation equivalent, but to seek safety in flight, or even here to become safe from danger by eluding or avoiding it. So he is not going with Jesus. Whether we want to defend that or not is maybe another question, but he's just like all the other disciples in that sense, that he can't stay awake, he can't keep his clothes on, he can't stick with Jesus, he can't do the arrest. And again, we're not necessarily evaluating that, but in Mark, it does, I think, add to this powerful scene where even this extra who, oh yeah, there's a chance, nope, him too, he's also running away. And I think Mark, with that, the word flee here, linking back to verse 50, I wonder if that's intentional on Mark's part. And that, to me anyway, that's my best read on why Mark includes this story. Let's come back to this last part in just a moment. I want to make sure we're up to date on comments or questions. Yes, this here's a good comment. Somebody says, on the passage, I love commentators' range of clarity from inconsequential coda versus most unique in all the Gospels. Yeah, and it can be somewhat entertaining to read. And sometimes, France is great about this. You'll get these just really witty, almost acerbic turns of phrase, even toward other commentators. Hopefully it's all done in good fun and in charity. But yeah, it is funny how you can get so many degrees of certainty even around the same passage. And inconsequential coda, I mean, that's certainly an interpretation. I'll just sort of leave that there. But yeah, thanks for that comment. I appreciate that as well. Here's another comment. This reminds me of Joseph leaving his cloak in his haste to get away. All right, interesting. Yep. Let's see, here's another comment. I'll put this in the chat and read it. All, meaning all 11 earlier, all fled. Judas, I imagine, remained there. And then this naked one also fled. Yeah, good point. Good point. You could clarify that in translation as well. These are great comments and questions. Feel free to keep them coming, and we'll start to head toward wrapping up here. I'm not starting the next passage today because I want to kind of have a fresh start with that. But just to revisit this question, I've said before in this series that I had a really good philosophy professor who would say, when you're reading a text, always ask the question, what's the author doing now? What's the author doing now? What's the author doing now? And that is the question here. And you don't even have to remember to ask that with these verses, because it just naturally comes up for all the reasons I've tried to show today. It feels unexpected, I think. Even though I've read this story many times before, preparing for today, it just still feels like, wow, that's really surprising. So why include this story? And I've said a little bit about what I think. I think France has a good point here that regardless of what Mark's intent may or may not have been, the impact on us is that it does add more, as France says, to the sense of Jesus's abandonment, and that not only the 11, but even this anonymous sympathizer can only run away. In fact, if you read this as John Mark, the author of the gospel, which I think is a big if, I mean, you could make your case for that, but if you read it as that adds even more than just what France is saying, because what France is saying is that this adds to the sense of abandonment as an anonymous sympathizer. If it is the author of the gospel, wow, even he ran away. And of course, we'll see with Peter denying him and Peter's close connection to Mark. I mean, this is really a just deep sense of abandonment. I mean, it is thoroughly just leaving Jesus. So you don't need to know who this is for that to ring true, but like I said, if you read this as John Mark, I think that adds even more power and pathos to this. Strauss, again, he has an interesting thing. He says yes to the abandonment for sure, but he also says Mark's purpose it could be to show the chaos that surrounded Jesus's arrest. And these are chaotic words or a chaotic setting. I mean, this whole wearing nothing but a linen cloth, however we translate that, whatever kind of cloth. I mean, again, I think Mark's purpose here is something about haste, because this is not the usual clothing, and that's why Mark tells us, I think. So there's something about haste here, things being out of the ordinary, things not being maybe as like slowed down or natural speed or timeline as they would be. And then they apprehend him. And then, I mean, this is certainly chaotic that he runs off, he's naked, he's leaving his linen cloth behind. Where he goes, we don't know. I mean, he runs off the narrative too, you know, it's, who knows. But I think this is a good point too. So Strauss gives us two reasons that Mark could have included this story: to show the chaos surrounding the arrest and the total abandonment of his followers. Now, both of those have come up in this passage already. And so I think that just makes perfect sense. So read that way, whether you think of this as an epilogue or a coda or consequential or not, I do think it's consequential. I think it's a recapitulation of some themes, because the chaos was already shown here with the say the striking off of the ear, or the attempted striking off of the ear. That's about as chaotic as it gets. Putting hands on and the apprehended him. I mean, this is not a peaceful scene. You know, this is not a flowing brook and green pastures. So the chaos is already there, and then the abandonment is already there, and even goes before this. So I like Strauss's read. I think, if just to summarize it with those two words, chaos and then abandonment, I think verses 51 and 52 give those to us, whatever else we make of them. And that's where I would land. And maybe we can wrap up there, is that I still have questions about this, who it is, what kind of clothing, why he's mentioned. Was he already a disciple? Was he just following him that day? Was it both? Great questions. And the reason Mark's including them, I think, as Strauss says, is to show the chaos, to show the abandonment. And again, if you think it's John Mark, there's an even more powerful rhetorical move, which is that Mark is saying, even I ran away. And you don't need that to be Mark for that move to take place, because we're going to move soon into Peter. Even Peter denied him. I mean, that is explicit. Peter is named. It's definitely Peter. No question about his identity. So we'll move into that next in this just amazingly powerful chapter. I mean, to me, it seems like the intensity is just continuing to build, and we are still several scenes away from the cross. And yet we've got a lot going on here. And Mark has done a lot with just a little bit, these 2 verses. We covered very little in terms of word count today, but I wanted to take the time to kind of tarry with this and think through what Mark's doing. The translation piece has some challenges as we looked at. I think you could, if your goal is translating straight through Mark, you could table some of the more speculative stuff for later, but I think at some point, I mean, we're probably not translating in a vacuum. At some point, you'll be sharing this with others or just doing it yourself or in a small group setting. These questions come up, so I wanted to at least scratch the surface of them. I've so appreciated your comments and questions and insights. Let's see what else you've got, and we'll move to wrapping up. Somebody says the mob arrived first. The disciples were ready to resist. The later arrival of the cohort, John 18:12, explains these events. Suddenly, all fled, and the attempt to detain the following single teenager by the cohort rear guard. I've got fall on the mind. Yeah, and so that's something we didn't do at all today, which is to compare this to the other gospel accounts. And so my first question, of course, would be, is this, I mean, anytime you've got a mysterious figure, is it in the parallels? Well, we did this, right, the other week with, or maybe it was just last week, with the cutting off of the ear, not named in Mark, named elsewhere. So we can go to the info pane, one of several ways to get to the synoptic parallels and see here whether this passage is included. He is not anywhere else. This is Mark alone. But you could look at this more this way. But anyway, that's all to say, thank you for the reference to John and your comment. And that is a good way, I think, to understand this. Not that it would, you know, you wouldn't bring Matthew into your Mark translation for the translation, but certainly for understanding. Oh, great. Thank you so much for this comment. Somebody says, thank you. Today's been a great webinar. You have had so many of this type in this series on translation of Mark. Truly an impactful series. I pray all these recordings remain available for years to come. Thank you. And I would echo that too. Yeah, I hope, I mean, who knows, who knows what the internet looks like even 10 years from now. But yeah, these are all up. And, you know, we weren't putting everything up, but there's something happened with the platform that made it really easy that they just post automatically. In fact, if you go, I think I showed this yesterday in the webinar, if you go to help and webinars, that's the quickest way to get at these. You'll even see our webinar in progress right now. It should show up right here under Western Hemisphere. Yeah, there it is. So you could even join from this page, but yeah, everything is here. The tiny URL has all of the notes, tinyurl.com/Mark translation notes. And that is a link to a Google Drive, a shared Google folder. I'm not sure why that's not working there, but the link is there on the handout if you want to get at them that way. Oh, Mark translation notes, that's because I didn't type it right. So tinyurl.com/Mark translation notes will get you this and all the other ones. Great comments and questions today, really appreciate it. You know, I'm of two minds when it comes to speculating with this stuff. On the one hand, it's super fun and interesting. On the other hand, I do want to exercise appropriate caution and not claim something I can't back up and that wasn't intended. But it sure is interesting to think about. And yeah, like I said, hours more of research could be done just on the identity of this guy. But I think that just to give Strauss the last word, this idea of chaos and this idea of abandonment are going to actually not just sum up this passage, but they'll carry forward with us as we continue, which we'll do next time. So thanks so much, everyone, for being here. I'm going to end the recording and then stay on for just another moment if you're here live. If you watch the recording, again, here's all the info up at the top to get the handout or to get in touch.